You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest on the podcast today, Tom McMillan. The book we will be discussing, The Year That Made America, From Rebellion to Independence, 1775 to 1776. Mr. McMillan, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Robert, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So why this year?
Why did I do it this year, or why did I choose that year?
See, you caught me, didn't you? A double move. Why this year? Why did you write it this year? And why did you choose this span? Because you have Kevin Phillips, who wrote about 1774, other books about 1775. A lot of authors, historians seem to have their year. This is the year where everything changed. And you chose 1775 to 1776, that span. Why?
The blend, most of the focus of the book is on the political struggle for the Declaration of Independence. That's what fascinated me. My suggested original title to the publisher was July 2nd, 1776, just to show that everything didn't happen on July 4th, which is one of the premises I try to make. But publisher thought, so we need to lead into this. There was so much that happened in 75 that led to these things didn't happen overnight. And so we thought we would encapsulate some of the early years, especially what happened in 1775, leading up to that very important thing, before I got into the dates and all the struggles and how close we came to not declaring independence in July of 1776. So it's just to me is a fascinating period. And as someone who, I've mostly been a Civil War guy, but I consider myself to be a pretty decent student of history. And I was astounded by how much I did not know about this period. We're taught this nice, neat little story, and there's so much that went on that fascinated me. I learned so much about so many other people beyond the normal heroes we look up to.
Please come back on the podcast and we can argue about my thesis that Gettysburg is the most overrated battle in American history. And I'll be happy to do that. I've been proven wrong by scholars such as Alan Gelzo, Michael Burlingame, and others. So you can join that.
You live part of the year in Gettysburg, but I also co-host a podcast called Antietam and Beyond. So I love Antietam as well. So I hear those debates all the time.
And I'm a Shiloh guy. We mentioned Gettysburg just for a second. I want to acknowledge, it's been a while, but acknowledge the passing of our friend Peter Carmichael, who was a good man and a great Hoosier and a terrific Civil War historian. He did so much for Gettysburg College and the Civil War Institute. Peter, we miss you. The Declaration of Independence. I don't want to get to the meat of your book right at this moment, but I'm bringing it up because I want to make sure that I ask you about this because it was so important in your book. And that is the growth of the importance and the intensifying of the legend that was the Declaration of Independence. It didn't start out as this holy document. Is that fair?
It's absolutely fair. It's amazing when you read how unimportant it seemed to those kids. In fact, John Adams thought the most important thing was the act in Congress, the act of voting for independence, not the document. That's why he didn't write it. Young Thomas Jefferson got the assignment because none of the other ones, they had other important things to do. They didn't think it was going to be that important. And it really is, by early 1777, it's forgotten for years. And when I say that to people, they look at me cockeyed and I say, it did what it was supposed to. It declared independence, but then we still had a war to fight. No one would have remembered this document if you don't win the war. There was a lot of other business that had to be taken care of. And it's really not until Adams and Jefferson get into politics that people start looking back. And as often with history, Robert, sometimes we don't realize how important it is at the time. It's looking back. Wow, was that an important time? Was that an important document? But I can tell you, John Adams, who's my favorite founder, but also very vain and jealous, he was ticked off for the rest of his life that he did not write it.
And he seemed to alternate between trying to hide it and not trying to hide it.
Yeah, yes, exactly. If you know his personality, you read between the lines of his writing, it's amazing to see, but he was boiling inside, and he always thought that Jefferson got too much credit. And that's why at the end he tried to create this story that he was the one who chose Jefferson to write it. But it's fascinating, the jealousies and those kinds of things. We think of these guys as Marvel heroes, but they had the same flaws as we all do. And it really humanizes them when you learn about it. I ended up liking him more when I found out all of those things about him.
Is that part of the premise or some of the brilliance of Founding Brothers?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And
The Ellis book.
one of my favorite, there's so many great books on that air, but one of my absolute favorite books there. Yes.
Staying with the Declaration of Independence for a second, and then we'll, as true historians, we'll stay true to the chronology. Why was the Declaration of Independence felt to be necessary?
I think part of it is it's so hard for us to get away from this concept that you know everything right away, that we have such information at our fingertips. Most of the people in, I'll call it the country, it wasn't really a country yet, had no idea this was going on. This wasn't, their progress in the Continental Congress wasn't covered daily by newspaper reporters, and obviously there was no other electronic media. So I think they needed a document for two reasons: to explain it to the people in America, what we were doing and why, and also as a justification for the rest of the world. And there are all sorts of debates as to which was the most important, but they need to lay out their case. Again, not just for the people here, but very much for the people here, but also for the European powers overseas. We can pick up an ally or two if they realize what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing. And most of it, when you read it today, most modern readers would get bleary-eyed because the vast majority of it is a listing of accusations against King George III, a few of which seem relevant to us today. But that was very important to them back then, to lay out the reasoning why they were declaring independence.
It's been a few years, but every once in a while I used to serve as the Republican on political panels, and a Democrat friend of mine would be up and we would talk about various issues. And the reason I bring that up is because I got excoriated one time by someone in the audience because they were discussing, and this was like 2012, right? So it's been a while, which is funny when I finish my sentence, about the state of politics in 2012. And all this negative campaigning and how it needs to go back to the way it was. And as a complete history snot, I had said, it's always been this way. In my view, you've only started to hear about it more, and technology and so on and so forth. And the guy disagreed, said that I needed to learn my history, which I loved. And I then called the Declaration of Independence the greatest negative political ad in the history of the world. So here's your chance to either be on my side, who's generous enough to host you on this podcast, or some unknown man I haven't seen since 2012. How far off am I? To that point you just made, where so much of the Declaration is about George III, which is interesting in itself, because first the colonists blamed everything on Parliament. Then you can take it from there, please.
Yeah, this was a document about him, and Jefferson had been working on some writings since 1774, developing those concepts. He didn't just out of the blue write this document. He'd been thinking about some of these things. And I know I went to a ceremonial reading last year at Independence Hall, and the audience, many of young people, does get bleary-eyed in the middle of it, because you hear the great second paragraph of self-evident truths and all men are created equal. And we think it's all going to be like that. It's not. It's a very functional document. British writers ever since then have said that Jefferson was actually too vague, that you can't figure out what he was saying in some of them, but he was just laying out the point. This is why, these are our complaints. This is why we're doing it. Yes, it was, again, it was that justification, not only to our people, and there were still plenty of loyalists in America, but certainly to those folks overseas and as potential allies. It was, I think, I agree with you. I knew a little bit about this, but it really opened my eyes doing this research. We focus so much on that beautiful second paragraph that there's so much more to the Declaration beyond it. And in fact, to them, the most important paragraph is one we rarely talk about today, which was the last one. If you
Last
read the
paragraph.
document, that's where they declared independence, not in the second paragraph, in the last one, because that was the writing style in the 18th century. You built a crescendo and made your point at the end. And so Congress in particular, when it did some editing, they did some serious editing on Jefferson and the committee's work. They added some phrases to that last paragraph because they wanted some things in there, which is why one of the quirks of the book, I don't know if we'll get to this or not, it's one of the reasons why there's a small passage of the Declaration on the wall of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. that was not written by Thomas Jefferson.
Please go ahead. No, I laughed out loud when I got to that part. I didn't know that. I've been to the memorial one time. I didn't know
And it's
that.
because we all think he wrote everything, which he was the original draftsman. He wrote most of it, but we have his draft. There were 86 editorial changes. Almost 50 of them were made by a 5-man committee of which Jefferson was a part, with Adams and Franklin. And then Congress itself made almost 40. Group editing is very difficult, but they did, and they cut out about 25% of what Jefferson wrote. They completely cut out his passage on blaming black slavery on the King George III. And they really rewrote that last paragraph. And how it got on the memorial is they're doing the memorial in the 1940s, and the committee has to pick which words go on. 1,300 words in the Declaration, they all can't be there. They picked a few hundred. But the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, big historian, big fan of Jefferson, wanted to see it, wanted his input. And he knew that last paragraph was important. And he inserted some of those phrases, wanted them on the wall, not knowing that Jefferson didn't write them. So it doesn't matter. No, everything's edited. My book was edited. Every written piece has always been. But it's funny, and it raises your eyebrow and shows you that history can sometimes play tricks on us. Thomas Jefferson is the primary author, but there were many others who contributed to this document.
Adams and Jefferson famously died on the same day, Jefferson first. But let's say that Adams lives for a few months longer and travels down to Virginia so that he can look at Jefferson's tombstone. What do you think he would have thought about the tombstone of the third president that doesn't mention he was ever president, but does mention he's the author of the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah. I think it would probably, they didn't speak or write, they became mortal political enemies for a number of years. They didn't speak or write for more than 10 years. But then they got together at the end. They buried the hatchet and they started writing back and forth. There were things they didn't agree on. But I think that mutual respect of having been in battle together, so to speak, not physical battle, but really political battle, there was a respect. I think Adams would have probably had his eyes opened a bit, that Jefferson thought that the first thing Jefferson had was the author of the Declaration, but also underscored how important that he felt it was to his legacy, and probably would have ticked Adams off. See, I should have written it. I know I should have written it. But why? We talk about religious freedom and founding the University of Virginia. It's astounding to us today. I wish I could have asked Thomas Jefferson why, of all things, being president of the United States, the third president, didn't make your tombstone that you wrote yourself. It's a mystery.
And it's also somewhat ironic because if you think about it, at least I think it's perhaps ironic, and then we'll move on, is that the legacy of John Adams from his progeny, of course, is amazing. Son is president. His grandson is the minister to Great Britain during the American Civil War, Charles Francis Adams, probably the greatest ambassador we've ever had to any country at any time. Certainly his performance was off the charts. He was a Civil War scholar. Then you have Henry Adams, the historian. The list goes on. I read a book by, I think it's Brooks Adams, something like that, in graduate school. So Adams certainly has his own legacy that, in terms of public service, far outshines anything of Jefferson's people.
Absolutely, he does. And he was the pillar of independence. He led the charge in Congress. If you believe, as I do, the most important thing was Congress voting for independence on July 2nd, 1776. Adams was the guy who led that. He was the fighter. He ticked people off, but he didn't care. He bulled his way in there. But I think his presidency was not very successful. He was only one term. And I think because of that, that became the blot on his resume. So there is no Adams memorial. There is no Adams statue in Washington, D.C., despite all of his accomplishments. Jefferson was a more successful president. And as the author of the Declaration, his reputation was so high that Adams didn't have that. If you're right, historians look at it, Adams actually, in my opinion, accomplished more. It should be more heralded than he is. But the Alien and Sedition Act and some other things in his presidency, and the fact that, that he only served one term, have changed the way we look at things. So David McCullough's book maybe helped to change that a little bit on John Adams, and the HBO miniseries John Adams, which helped to spawn the idea in me for writing this book. But he will never catch up to Jefferson in history.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends. Our guest is Tom McMillan, the author of The Year That Made America, From Rebellion to Independence, 1775 to 1776. Take us back to set the stage for the beginning of your book. So much is happening. The end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, and the Stamp Acts and all that. And I want to prompt you to discuss the Quebec Act, because most people don't put that in as one of the biggies. And that was the one that drove the colonists, I think, most crazy from maybe a non-economic point of view. All these things start to happen. Take us back. What's going on in the colonies, and how are the British handling their disturbed cousins?
Historians have never quite figured out the date that the revolution began. There's no way of totally figuring that out because it was a gradual thing. Certainly after the French and Indian War, the British wanted the Americans to pay their fair share. They'd spend a lot of money over here, they thought, defending us. And the Stamp Act protest was created. The Stamp Act Congress was the first Congress that developed over here. And some of these guys who were there in the mid-70s were there as well. And that's where taxation without representation came from. Then series of events, and I probably had to breeze through these too quickly because I needed to get to 1776, but you have to set them up. You can't just start at 1776. I mean, the Boston Massacre in 1770, the Boston Tea Party in 1773, Lexington and Concord, clearly where it came to blows, and we're fighting in some modern day Americans are still surprised that Lexington and Concord happened before the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. We're fighting a war a year before we declared independence. And you'll read some of this was the Declaration itself gave the soldiers something. It isn't really tangible, but something tangible to fight for. It was a cause. The biggest struggle back then was a demand, which is why we had the First Continental Congress, to restore their rights as British subjects. They thought they were not being treated equally with other citizens of England or other British subjects around the world. And you can debate back and forth how serious that was, but that's what the Americans believed. And the British, to use a sports term, and I worked in sports, never quite read the play correctly. They could have solved this very easily, much long before it got to July 1776. Now, would America have become independent eventually? Yes. This is a little, as Thomas Paine wrote, an island can't rule a continent. Something could have happened. But right back then, they could have easily appeased the colonists. And I think as he sometimes happens with politicians today, I think the king didn't have all the information. I don't know what he would have done if he had. But the colonists were convinced that Parliament wasn't passing on some of that information to them. It's why they kept writing. John Dickinson and others wrote so many documents to try to get them to the king. They thought if the king saw what their complaint was, that he would solve things. Now, once he saw those, he didn't. He was upset, and more than anyone, he wanted to crush this. This will come to blows, he wrote to them, which really started some of the movement toward the Declaration in January of 1776. But it's all over the place. It's not well defined. And that reading about that, these were things that we've all heard of, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, but the reasoning behind them, what went on, the Townshend Acts, there's a lot of detail there that I think in modern history we don't get. We don't have enough time. So I tried not to belabor those points, but I tried to lay them out. Because as a writer too, I wanted to get to 1776. That was really why I was writing. But you can't just, my editor was right, you can't just start on January 1st, 1776. You have to explain it.
Some books that I've read, and maybe going back to graduate school or college or whatever, termed the really were judgmental towards the colonists. In other words, you're the most prosperous people in the world. What the hell are you complaining about?
Yeah.
Is that a fair criticism? In other words, were some of the complaints of the colonists overwrought or unfair?
Oh, absolutely. I think for sure. If you look at this, for sure. But in any one of these disputes you're going to have, they had very credible complaints. And then they were looking for any little thing to hang this on, and they did. And some of them were lawyers, and you know how lawyers get. They pick any little opening. They were picking those things to lead to complaints. Again, going back to there was a book not long ago written by an author in England who took apart some of Jefferson's complaints about the king. So, what's this sentence mean? What's he talking about here? Jefferson never explained those things individually. It was just the great glob. There were so many of them that if you go back and read it, and I still believe most modern day Americans have not read the Declaration of Independence beginning to end. Be a little bored by it, but you have to put yourself. I did after I understood a lot more after doing this kind of research, but I still didn't understand it all. And we can never put ourselves totally in their place. And Jefferson never really explained that. He never went through it. He'd achieved his goal. He moved. He had so many other things to do. He never explained it point to point. One of the frustrating things about history is that happens. Sometimes we don't know. I was really amazed doing this research at how little about this was from these guys involved in Congress was written in 1776. Probably a couple of reasons. One, they were busy. Two,
Right.
if this didn't work out, they were hanging for treason. They didn't want a lot of evidence. So a lot of what we know of this period was written by Adams and Jefferson in the 1820s when they were the first person sources, but they're very old men.
Yeah, that's exactly what Adams lived. He was the oldest living president.
Yeah.
He lived longer than anyone else for a couple of centuries
Yeah.
until I think Reagan broke it, and now it's been broken. The record's been extended several times. There wasn't, trying to piece together what you just said, there wasn't a whole lot of reflection and or scholarship contemporaneous with the Declaration of Independence itself. It's just like we did this and we moved on.
At the time, it wasn't considered that important. Pauline Maier did a great book on the Declaration about 35 years ago, and she was writing about, she was a professor at Harvard, and said that it really wasn't until the War of 1812 generation, that group in the 1820s, so much had happened in 40 years, we'd fought the British twice, that started looking back and saying, wait a second, what happened? How did this happen? A couple of these guys are still alive, Adams and Jefferson. So they started to ask the questions. There were newspapers back then, but they weren't reporters like today. Nobody was asking questions at the time. And so what we have is just what these guys chose to write. Thankfully for John Adams, he wrote a lot. He has the most complete record of that period, I think. A lot of these other guys wrote occasionally. And by the way, Robert, there is, for the listeners, it would have been very difficult to do this book in a timely fashion without the National Archives online service called Founders Online. It's phenomenal. There are tens of thousands of documents digitized, written by these guys, all of Adams's letters, all of Franklin's letters, all of Jefferson's letters, digitized by date. Most people don't know it exists. It would have taken so much work, but if I had done this book 30 years ago, I'd been down at the archives paging through the actual letters or here you could just call hey, what did Adams write to Jefferson on July 10th, 1776? And up it pops. So these guys wrote their own history. And as a historian, there's always a little, dangerous the wrong word, but a little danger in that because we all put our own spin on it, right? We always want ourselves to look good. No Civil War unit ever retreated, and they would gallantly fell back because the unit on the side fell back. So you have to color it a little bit that way. But thankfully they wrote as much as they did. I really was stunned at the beginning how little was written, for instance, about this in the summer of 1776. And part of that, to your point, may have been even they didn't realize there was so much going on. The war's going on at the same time. I have to keep reminding myself that the war's going on, and it's pretty close to these guys. So to your point, they weren't sitting back and reflecting a lot on what they did or how important it would be. And had the Americans not been successful in the war, no one would remember much of this period.
That's the great point, right? The winners, the history. This time, it just took them a little bit longer. When we, as the public, go to the National Archives to view the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which versions are we seeing? And you don't have to
Yes.
answer for the Constitution since that's not part of your book, but it's such a phenomenal. I've never not gotten goosebumps when I've stared at him. I've seen him 4 or 5 times. Are we looking at a particular copy of the Declaration?
Every time. So when I do my book talks, I talk about that. You have to figure out some things before you sit down and start writing. And one of mine was, which was the official version, the official printed version of the Declaration? Because if you Google that phrase, you'll come up with 3 or 4 different designs. The words are all the same. They're presented differently. And wait a second. That version that's there, that's at the archives, the handwritten version, the hand-signed version, is the second version of the Declaration. The first one was typeset. That's the one that they sent out on the night of July 4th to a printer in Philadelphia named John Dunlop. And they wanted 200 one-sheet broadsides. He printed them, returned them on July the 5th. And those are the ones that John Hancock started sending to the colonial assemblies, to General Washington to read to the troops in New York, to our representatives in England and overseas. But if you look at it, the title does not include the word unanimous. It just says Declaration. And by the way, this thing was never called formally the Declaration of Independence. It has long titles. But it's a formal title at the top. Nobody signed it. There are only 2 names on it. John Hancock as the president and Charles Thompson as the secretary. That's the first one. That's what was sent out. And that's the version that was published in newspapers throughout July and August and was read in town squares, because a lot of this was done in those public readings. That's how people learned of things. And at top is the phrase, in Congress, July 4th, 1776. That's the first line people read, the first one they heard. That's how July 4th of all these days became our Independence Day. But then,
and we'll get to that.
we get that. And then it's because the vote on July 2nd was 12 votes for, none against, 1 abstention. New York's delegation still did not have permission from its assembly back home.
And when you say votes, 12, you're voting by state, not by
Yes.
delegate.
Each colony had 1 vote. 12 votes for, none against, 1 abstention. New York was still abstaining because they hadn't got that permission. Then on July 9th, the New York Assembly meets up there and said, wait a second, we better get with the program. So they write up a document that their guys can vote. It sends down to Congress, gets there July 15th, and somebody says, well, we need a new version of the Declaration. We need to say unanimous. So on July 19th, they assign a man to handwrite a version and to leave some space at the bottom because we want to sign this. It's a man named Timothy Matlack, and most people know his name only because it's mentioned in the Nicolas Cage movie. And he turns it back in on August the 2nd of August, and that is the first day that those guys start to sign the Declaration. Not July 4th, not in July. It's the second version of it. And historians believe that 47 of them signed that day, and the other 9 signed through the fall and winter because everybody wasn't there all the time. But that one, Robert, was not released to the public at that point. Nobody knew at that point who signed the Declaration. Why? The war wasn't going very well. There was a little treason thing going on. It's not until Washington crosses to Delaware, gets some victories, and in January, they come up with a 3rd version. They're meeting in Baltimore, and again, typeset, unanimous declaration that identifies the signers by state. So that the first 2 did not do that. So you have 3 official versions commissioned by the Continental Congress, but the signed one is the one that to us is the Declaration of Independence, and that's the one that is at Independence Hall. And thankfully, John Quincy Adams had the sense in the 1820s to order a stone engraving made of that because they didn't understand about how light could damage documents back then. You get there, it's so faded, you can barely read it. John Quincy Adams, back when it was faded, but not quite this bad, he had the exact replica. So the version that you see in books, in my book and others, that's from the stone engraving of it, not the original, because you can barely read the original.
What about the first version with just 2 people?
It's still there, but that's not the one. They show the signed version at the Declaration. That's at the archives, but it's not in the display you're talking about where they do our founding documents. It's the handwritten version, which again is the one that's the most famous because it has their signatures.
You're listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise and federally certified veteran-owned small business. Our guest today, Pittsburgh Penguins PR guy.
Yes.
You
Retired.
is Mario on your speed dial in case we need him?
Every once in a while.
Tom McMillan, he's a retired sports PR executive. I'm based here. I do PR for a living here in Indianapolis, and we're in the epicenter of Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Pacers at the moment.
Absolutely.
He's written several books. He lives in Coraopolis, Pennsylvania,
Often when you have to order
Gettysburg,
something online and spell that to people.
and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which if anyone listening has not been to the Gettysburg National Battlefield and Memorial, it is, take your tissues. That's all I'll tell you. It's a beautiful place. We're discussing his book, The Year That Made America. Tom, do you have a Hoosier leader and or legend you admire most?
I've never been asked that question, so I don't know that I've ever given it a thought. I don't know. I may have to whiff on that one.
You can say Larry Bird.
I would have said Larry Bird is probably close. When I was moving, lived briefly in San Diego, and I moved back to Pittsburgh, and I particularly on purpose drove through French Lick. I had to do it. I had to see, because in my years as a sports writer, I covered several finals, NBA finals that Celtics and Lakers were a part of. Just an unbelievable time in sports. And he is rather
We've had Bob Ryan on the podcast.
a
And
legend of sports media.
oh, he's great. And Jackie McMullen came on. Both
Another
who have
legend.
written, both who have written books involving Larry Bird. I guess you could also, we have Benjamin Harrison here, whose grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence. You mentioned King George a few minutes ago. He's very young when he comes to the throne in 1760, reigns until 1820, famously or infamously deranged for many years towards the end of his reign. What kind of advice is he getting? Why does he become so sour towards the colonists and, let's say, the colonists' demands?
It's hard to get inside his head. One, and I think the colonists were correct in that they weren't sure how much information he was getting. We don't know that. Did Parliament pass these documents on, or was it one of those, sometimes you just can't, in a company, you just can't get to the CEO. And no, you can't do that. So I think, no, we're not going to bother him with this. So I think there probably was some of that. But I also think if you grow up in that environment, you're out of touch. And it's hard to believe. It would be hard enough today, but imagine overseas, things would happen. It would take documents 3 months to cross the ocean. Everything could have changed by the time your document gets there. So for him to understand what these common folk who had come across the ocean were thinking, I'm sure it seems to be from some of his writing, he was offended by this. What do you mean? How could you not want to be? The feeling was, how could you not want to be part of the greatest empire in the world? There were politicians in Britain who sided with the colonists in a way, or at least sympathized with them, and thought they should take their complaints more seriously. But I do think there was a detachment and an arrogance. Britain's arrogance during this, added by the distance across the ocean, really added to it. Because I said earlier that they could have probably solved it, or at least smoothed things over for what, 10, 15 years in 1774, 1775, before shots were fired.
And you mentioned, you actually led me to my next question. You mentioned there's a few folks, members of parliament and philosophers, thinkers, who are sympathetic to the Americans. And these folks weren't backbenchers.
No, there's some prominent people writing. Hey, it's similar to our politics today. Everybody, none of this is monolithic. We think of the British. We see the red uniform and haughty ceremonies. No, there were a lot who thought differently. They had opposition parties. There was opposition there. In the Houses of Parliament voted differently, and there were some people, some of whom had been here, and some of who had known people. So even if they weren't here, they had a better sense of what was going on. And I think those are the folks who thought, we can solve this very easily without giving up too much and keep these people in the empire. And they were also the ones who thought, wow, if we could keep America, look at the size of that continent, we can keep that in our empire, nobody could ever stop us. And that was part of their thing. Now, I think eventually they would have been overwhelmed by that. I think that wouldn't have been Thomas Paine's line, an island can't rule a continent. But back then, they didn't know that. So there were people, it wasn't 100% feeling in Britain that the colonists were wrong. Some thought that there were some very good points made and they should be accommodated.
momentum. Momentum as a force in history is something that's always fascinated me. One thing after another. It's perverse domino theory, even though I'm not sure that analogy works. And so things just started to happen. And then they start to really happen. And at a certain point, the protests against the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Quebec Act, the coercive acts, all those things. Boston Tea Party, which is, I think you said 1773. The first Congress is 1774. April 19th, 1775 is Lexington and Concord, followed up very closely by Bunker Hill. Is there a particular turning point or a sense that you have as a historian that said, when we reached this point, everything that followed afterward is perfectly logical and expected?
It's hard again to pick one date, one moment, but if I had to pick one, this isn't definitive. It was the shots at Lexington and Concord. Once it became a shooting war, that changed the dynamic. And I think that brought some of the people off the fence. Wait a second. They're coming here and shooting. They're trying to kill our people and take our stores. I think that, again, it wasn't overnight, but I think people were shocked that this had happened. And also then feel, wow, the underdog militia did pretty good here. We could fight these guys. They chased the redcoats back. So there certainly were many ebbs and flows after that. But I think that also changed it on the other side for the king. You read, he doesn't talk about this directly, but if you read between the lines of his documents, he was furious that this had happened, that his subjects had temerity to fire guns at his troops who were there to protect them. And so I really think from that point on, it would have been difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, to use a bad cliche.
Sure.
And yet with all that, it still took a lot of time. There were still a lot of people, as I mentioned in the book, Robert, mid-June 1776, there were still 6 colonies that weren't going to vote for independence. That's 2 weeks before the vote. It happened that the pressure built for a number of reasons. Thomas Paine's book, more fighting. There's so many different things. You can't pinpoint one, but if I had to pick one moment, it would be 1775, April 19th.
Please expand on Thomas Paine's book, because you do a terrific job of detailing it in your book.
Yeah, he really had incredible impact on what went on. And fascinating because he wasn't a member of Congress, hadn't been an American for very long. He'd only been here for basically a year. Born and raised in England, had pretty much failed at everything he tried in life, failed in business, failed in marriage. But he had met Benjamin Franklin when Franklin was posted in England. So when he came to Philadelphia, Paine looked Franklin up. And Franklin got him a job writing in a local magazine. And Paine then did some of his own writing on the side. And I really think from reading, I didn't realize this until reading It's Common Sense again and doing the research, his superpower was that he could write for the common man. Most of the writing back then was written by lawyers like John Adams. Most people weren't educated. It went over their heads. They did not understand it. Paine could write for the cobblers and the blacksmiths and the farmers. And again, he said simple things like an island can't rule a continent. Basically, the tone was, what are we doing here? And he also was able to go after King George in very personal terms in ways that the Continental Congressmen couldn't. They had to show some sort of respect and political decorum. So it electrified the countryside. Paine would have been great on social media. People would love the way he didn't have those restraints. And sometimes people say that book got too much credit, but it sold tens of thousands of copies. There weren't that many people back then. We'd all die for those sales right now.
3 million colonists. How many of them can read? And
yeah,
the delegates to the Continental Congress, they're also, to your point you made at the beginning of the podcast, they're always looking to Europe. So they can't have this anti-monarchical screed. They can say George III is rude, but they don't want to go against the entire establishment when they're looking for France and Russia and obviously Spain to be on their side. I thought Common Sense, not only the language, which you're dead on the money, the timing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just right.
Yeah. And it came out just as the king had given a speech in October of 1775, but it didn't get across the ocean until early January, where he really went after the colonists. He basically threw down the gauntlet then. He said, I see what you're doing. You don't want to restore your rights. You want to break away from us. And he threatened military action. So Paine's book came out just after that, and people are learning about that and reading the King's speech. So you're right, the confluence of timing and things, talk about momentum, that really started, it wasn't the singular act, but it's really started that momentum throughout the countryside. But again, a lot of basic Americans did not have any idea what was going on in Philadelphia. They weren't sitting there in New Hampshire and Georgia and South Carolina saying, I wonder what the Congress is deciding today. They weren't turning on CNN. They didn't know. Paine's book clarified it for them in many ways and really turned the tide. And I think when I spoke about some of those colonial assemblies not being approved even by June to vote for independence, it's because they had gone there earlier. They'd received instructions. The tone in the countryside had changed in those 3 or 4 or 5 months. And a significant amount of that was because of Paine's book.
This is directly from your book. The official congressional records of Tuesday, July 2nd, 1776, are almost comically benign. Delegates reviewed 4 letters from military officers, one from the Council of Massachusetts Bay, and one from the Paymaster General on weekly accounting matters. When the Great Resolution on American Independence was introduced at about mid-morning, Congress reported only that it was, quote, agreed to, close quote. As a historian, as a researcher, what was it like for you in the moment when you stumbled, or that's not fair, when you found this?
It's accurate. I stumbled on it.
When you found this little nugget of historical chronology?
Yeah, it just makes you, it takes you back. In its own way, it takes your breath away that's all they said. And they had to have known. I do think it's so sparse because they were concerned about treason. They were concerned about putting too much down in the record. And it's frustrating to research because they didn't write more about what they thought. We get this later. But I think today, the way we look at the 4th of July and independence, most modern Americans, if they read that, will be stunned. That's the way it was presented at the time. And in fact, Robert, that day they voted. So we actually declared independence on July 2nd, but they didn't make an announcement. They didn't put out a press release. Thankfully, someone, we don't know who, leaked it to a Philadelphia newspaper. And that evening, in its evening edition, the Philadelphia Evening Post, on page 4, in the middle of page 4, with no headline, one sentence, under a letter that someone had written and above an ad for somebody selling boats, it said the colonies declared independence today. Breaking news. That's how they announced it.
You said earlier, and this was something that I didn't really ever put together, which is a sad commentary on how much I've understood on all the books that I've read on this, the importance of the Declaration of Independence when it came to getting the attention of the foreign powers, without which, and I just did a podcast on the Battle of Saratoga, which to me is the most impactful battle in the history of the United States. But how much of the Declaration was meant for foreign eyes and ears, and it wasn't an accident. It was very the Americans were very strategic about how they worded it, who they sent over there, what the goals were. Please take it.
Yes, and even when Richard Henry Lee proposed independence on June 7th, 1776, we hear that he proposed independence, but there were 3 items of that, one of which was establish alliances with foreign countries. We knew as this little fledgling country with not much of an army, we were going to need support. And there were countries out there that would, i.e. France, that would like to take advantage of England and sense a weakness. And part of it was to explain to them what we were doing, that there was a reason for what we were doing. We've thought this out. Here are our reasons of this is what's happened to us. This is why we're trying to break away. We're not just these rebels who in a hot-headed moment decided we want to be independent. It was shown that this was a process. We had a Congress, we had leaders, and how much the Declaration had an impact, I don't know, other than electrifying much of the world that this had happened, that somebody had, to use the word temerity again, the temerity to stand up to England. And clearly, as we know, there was some support from other countries as well, but without France's support, this would have been very difficult to win. And clearly they saw it as a finger in their eye to their rival England. So, that's the way the world is today, too. The things, so many more things change than they remain the same. So many things you can, and that's one thing that opened my eyes. And I agree with you earlier when somebody was saying the politics are so divisive today. They've always been divisive. Read what happened. We almost didn't get the Declaration of Independence through in July 1776. It's always been that way, and it probably always will be that way.
You, in your book, you do a very good job of chronicling how not only potential allies, but how England, Great Britain itself took notice of the Declaration of Independence. It was printed, it was discussed, it was critiqued. Did that make any difference in the war, in the debate in Parliament about what we should do about these folks?
I think it did. I think to the pro-American folks, it may have justified it a little bit. This is what they're doing. Glad they did this. Others were just appalled. Again, that they would have the fortitude to do this against the king. And in one of the editions of one of the English papers, there was a word. King George was accused of many things, and they edited it to they, because they wouldn't even let the colonists attack the king, even though they did in their paper. They didn't want the people to know that. So some of the edits were made that way. And clearly there was mocking of declaring independence and all men are created equal in a country where there was slavery. What are you talking about, you hypocrites? Probably the biggest charge from England, if it wasn't, how can you be so unappreciative of what we've done to you? It's that, how can you be so hypocritical? You're saying all men are created equal. You're saying you want freedom for all. Look what you're doing. What do you think?
The drivers of Negroes.
Yes. Yes.
The brilliant phrase.
Yes.
Really cut right to it. George III, I feel bad. I've read a couple of books about him. He should never even been king then. His dad died, and he went right from George II past Frederick to George III. He never really reconciled, despite the John Adams thing and I think it's Benjamin West he's talking to. What's George Washington going to do now? And he says he's going to go back to Mount Vernon. And George III supposedly said, if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world. The king himself, Parliament went on. They pretty soon had to start fight Napoleon and all these other things and continue their winning streak against France, which stretched all the way back to the Duke of Marlborough. But George III never recovered.
Once you lose something like that, you're always going to be mocked as the guy who lost America, who lost the war. There was no way of recovery from that. And then probably realized too that, oops, there were things I could have done to prevent this. We don't know that he thought that, but he probably did. That would make it even worse. If you thought you did the right thing and it just didn't work out, I gave it my best shot. But in this case, again, as we said, there were opportunities to have appeased the American colonists, at least for a while. They could have extended this 5-10 years, perhaps, if they just agreed to what would have been some very simple things.
I'm in the middle of reading several books about Vietnam for a series of podcasts with Brian Vandemark, who's the leading Vietnam historian in the world, is what he is. And he's incredibly gracious and generous with his intellect. But reading these books, it's every single time the American government could have zigged, they zagged. And it seems to me, going back 200 years prior, before Vietnam, that every time the British government, the Parliament, the monarchy zigged, they should have zagged. Yeah. There's a series of these decisions where you just are like, God, why are you doing that?
Why are you doing? Yeah, exactly. And magnifying it, then it takes you 2-3 months to find out that a decision was made on either side. And had you known that in real time, maybe things would have been different. Maybe things could have been different. The War of 1812 should never have happened. They basically solved it, but we didn't know they solved it, so we started fighting.
The Battle of New Orleans should have never happened.
Yeah, absolutely. It shouldn't have started, and it was over, and they didn't know it was over. Those things it's really hard for modern audiences. Even we know it, but we're just so used to having all this information at our fingertips, especially now, but even back when you and I grew up, we had so much information at our fingertips. It's hard to imagine that it would take 2 or 3 months to find out something. And yet you had to make a decision in those 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, that's the key part. You had to make the decision. I want to read something before we get to the 5 questions that we ask all of our guests, I'm going to ask Tom McMillan about something he wrote that made me shut the book, made me close the book and think. And it's talking about the revival of the Declaration of Independence began with the dawn of partisan politics in the 1790s, which we talked about earlier in the podcast. Absurd as it seems now, I had to hesitate because I want to make sure I read this correct. Absurd as it seems now, this battle, this partisan battle, pitted the Constitution against the Declaration, with warring factions using them as props in heated arguments. It was especially true after most Republicans learned for the first time, emphasis in the original, about Jefferson's role in writing the Declaration. As one scholar noted, quote, Jefferson became one of the leaders of the opposition party to the administration of George Washington, and Jefferson's Republican supporters began celebrating him as an author. Now, dog-earing books should be a capital offense. I dog-eared that because it was so powerful and it was so new to me. Please expand on your paragraph.
Yeah, and just because it's difficult to confuse people, it was not the Republican Party of today. It was a different, but it's called the Republicans. But yes, there was the Federalists, which one party of Adams and Washington, and believed in a strong central government. And they were the ones who then would latch on to the Constitution as the most important document. The Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson and Madison, believed the Declaration was most important. And part of that was because when they found out Jefferson wrote it, the point you brought up we hadn't mentioned, in the 1770s, nobody knew who the primary author was. It wasn't until the 1780s that it came out. So once
Did they
Jefferson
care? I mean, not only did they not know, did they even care?
I don't think the Congress wrote it. I don't think they never saw anything about that. And even the letters from the congressman at that time never said Jefferson did a great job. Nobody mentions Jefferson as having, it's not 2 years later that we find this out. Again, amazing how that's astounding to us today. But as Jefferson rose to power and led his party and became president, it became the Declaration then was the important, because that was his document. That's Thomas Jefferson's document. That's what we declared independence. And the Federalists with Adams, oh no, it's the Constitution. That's the one that created the country. Believe it or not, they pitted them against each other. And eventually, the Federalist Party petered out after the War of 1812. And it led to a completely different party system. But it's hard for us to imagine today that you would have been arguing. We hold those two in such esteem as equal founding documents. And yet back then, because of political partisanship, again, which has been there since the very beginning, and the two, Adams and Jefferson are the twin pillars of independence. They became mortal political enemies over the way the country should have been run. And basically states' rights against the central government.
Sure. Is part of that because the Constitution, the language was changeable through amendments and the Declaration of Independence was settled?
Never thought of it that very well could be, but I took it as it established the central government, which until this time, no one had ever thought of. That it was a totally new concept. And as we know, up until at least the Civil War, what happened in your state was most important. That was your country back then. And part of that was just travel. You didn't get anywhere. This idea of 13 colonies and a central government, it's why the Articles of Confederation failed. The central government for those first few was so weak. We were afraid of having another king. It was like, we just got rid of a king. We don't want to have another king. And then Washington used that. And his great act of stepping down, which is the musical Hamilton is very entertaining, but that's one of the great lines where they're arguing back and forth. They say, who's president of John Adams? I can't believe John Adams. Well, they didn't say that, but it might have been close. But yeah, it was, again, Robert, part of this opening my eyes as someone, I thought of myself as a pretty decent student of history. I didn't know any of this. You study it in school, but you never get that deep, and I just hadn't read that deeply about it. And this is just about this topic. It's not about the battles. There's so much of this revolutionary period that I think during these 2 years, and back to the year, why did it come out? My editor wanted to come out the year before 1776 to set the table when maybe get out there before some of the other books. But it really, I think we are going to start to be so much material, and we're going to read some of that. And hopefully we'll learn, and hopefully people can learn from this book. When I tell people, I said, this was my own research journey to find out all these things that I didn't know about this important period. Hopefully I am able to take the reader along on that, but that's what it became. When I read Civil War books, I knew a little bit about what happened. It wasn't, you always learn something, but it wasn't like this. This was really eye-opening because I knew the basic July 4th story, and that's about it.
What percentage of the basic July 4th story we were taught as kids is accurate?
The part we're taught is accurate. It's just that we make it all like everything happened on the 4th of July. That was the only important date. And there were so many, it's a reason, Robert, why there's not a chapter in the book, as you've seen it, titled the 4th of July, but I have the 9th of January, the 15th of May, the 7th of June, the 2nd. And it's to underscore that point. There were many important dates, some of them just as important as the 4th of July. And if those events of those dates had not happened, we'd be telling a little bit different history. But because that first printed document, when they ran it in the papers or read it, the first phrase people heard was in Congress, July 4th, 1776. Because Adams always thought July 2nd should have been when Congress voted. He wrote the great thing to his wife, Abbott, the 2nd of July will be the greatest epoch in American history. But even a year later, Adams was calling July 4th Independence Day. So it doesn't matter, but I think we synthesize it and winnow it down to one event, one day. And people think the Declaration was written on the 4th, it was signed on the 4th, and they think all these things happened. And it really was a build-up to all this.
Joshua Lewis Chamberlain tried to bring July 2nd back to its prominence. We have reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. McMillan, are you ready?
I'm ready. I hope.
What was your first job?
Newspaper boy.
What was your first concert?
Chicago. In Pittsburgh, the band Chicago.
Terry Kath? Was it that early?
No, when would it have been? It would have been early 70s.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Biography of John Adams by David McCullough. He's my favorite historian, and it's just a phenomenal book. It opened my eyes. It's just brilliantly written. It's deep history, but readable deep history, which is really hard to do. McCullough was absolutely the best. My fellow Pittsburgh. I think he's the best at that. He doesn't write academically, but it's very well researched, and I admire him greatly.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. As long as I was protected.
I was going to say, from Seminary Ridge or Cemetery Ridge?
Over the sea.
Now, just very quickly, why that? Because why does that particular charge appeal to you?
Gettysburg is pretty close to Pittsburgh, so I've always been fascinated. I've been accessible to Gettysburg, so I've been here a lot, and I've studied the war and the battle a lot. But just because of the way they preserved the battlefield, you can walk that field. And you can stand along the Confederate line where Lee and Pickett and Longstreet stood, and you can walk straight across. And you just imagine, what must it have been like? And then you could stand on the Union side and read how terrifying it must have been to see 12,000 soldiers with bayonets gleaming, walking across, who had defeated you so many times before, walking across. Just in that moment of the time, what people were thinking. And I know they've written a lot about it, but the soldiers only know what happened right in front of them. And historians do a great job of piecing it together, but we still can never imagine. And I just, that's one of those moments in history that it has always and will always fascinate me.
The march in the sun, in the heat, in wool uniforms, without shoes, most of them. The list goes on and on. It's just a remarkable mindset.
Yeah.
Forgive me. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
I think my favorite. Wow. Probably John Meacham, the historian. Just he's written so many about figures in this era. I just like to get into a historian of that magnitude. And I would say close tie with Joseph Ellis. who's another one of my favorite. You mentioned Founding Brothers. So maybe there'd probably be a tie there. I'd have to flip a coin. But I think I've done this as an amateur. I know how hard it is. I know what an achievement feels like to write a book. Those guys have set the standards for writing. Me talking about Lincoln and Jefferson and Jackson and Ellis, just so much about this period, just to pick their brains about how they did it, what they think. As when you interview authors, it'd be the same thing. It'd be sitting down with one of those guys over dinner and a bottle of wine, and let's talk about what's happened.
I've been, to be candid, I've been very lucky. Whether it's Evan Thomas or Clint Hill, who recently passed,
the
the Secret Service agent, Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy, who wrote The Men Who Lost America. The list goes on and on. I've just been very, I don't take it for granted. I'm very grateful.
I've seen it's an impressive list of guests. I'm so honored to be on it. But Clint Hill would have been one of mine. As I was 7 years old when that happened, I remember being sent home from school, JFK assassination. He always fascinated me. I watched every time he was on TV. I read his book. I would have loved to have spoken to him as well.
Just to put a bow on that as we end the podcast, I reached out to him. He had a website and just said, I want to talk about the day. I've had Gerald Posner on the podcast. He was fabulous.
Yeah.
Terrific, investigative sort of writer.
Yeah.
But I had Hill on and I said, I just want to talk about the day, what happened, why it happened, all that sort of thing. No gore, no conspiracy. He gave me over an hour and he couldn't have been more honest and more forthright. Most of the people who've listened to my podcast, that is their favorite one. And it's because of him.
Yeah, I can understand that. It would have been fascinating. And he made a great contribution to history by continuing to talk about it. He was very available and very troubled. He took blame, you could tell that was authentic regret that he couldn't have done more. I'm sure you felt it. I always felt it every time I heard him speak when I read it. I should have been able to do more.
And I'll send you, if you don't mind, I'll send you the link. But he details just very quickly that Oswald had all the advantages. All of them.
Yeah.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise and federally certified veteran-owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Tom McMillan, author of The Year That Made America, From Rebellion to Independence, 1775, 1776. It's a marvelous book. Thank you so much, sir, for coming on the podcast, and let's figure out a way to have you on again.
Would love to, Robert. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.